Greetings. I wanted to give a brief rebuttal to Gabriel Thomas Ragnar's response to David W. Brosseau's lecture on what the early Christians believed about images and prayers to saints. I'm going to limit myself to the issue of images. Maybe at some other time I'll do prayers to saints. You can find in the description to the video below links to both David and Gabriel's videos, as well as the references for all of the quotations I'll be providing. Less than 10 minutes into David's lecture, he cites several early Christians, not just to the effect that they reject the worship of idols, obviously, but more specifically, quotations that have content that would preclude necessarily the idea that these Christians would then put their writing implements down and turn around and render veneration to icons of Christ or the apostles. To this effect, he cites Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Hippolytus, Origen, Cyprian, Arnobius, and Lactantius. I wanted to give just a couple other quotations from additional writers. The first one is the earliest source I've been able to find in my studies. This is from Aristides, dated to circa 125 AD. He writes, "Great then is the error into which the Chaldeans wandered in adoring lifeless and good-for-nothing images." And what is it to venerate icons other than to give them adoration? We also have Minucius Felix's utterances. "And so it is, these impure spirits, demons, as the Magi philosophers and Plato have demonstrated them to be, lurk in hiding beneath consecrated statues and images." He continues, "It is in this way that they drag down men's souls away from heaven, alluring them from the true God towards material things." And that's what we see in Brosseau's quotations as well. It's all about if you involve material things in your worship or in rendering religious honors, and what else is it to venerate icons than to give them religious honor, then this is a deviation from the apostolic tradition. It is an error. Now, Gabriel attempts to respond to this by characterizing Brosseau's argument as, if it looks like a duck and it sounds like a duck, then it must be a duck, which he identifies as a logical fallacy. It's ironic then that Gabriel would turn around and use that very logical fallacy against Brosseau. Given the lack of textual evidence for his position for the veneration of icons, he instead points to the mere existence of pre-Nicene Christian artwork, and then he conflates that with the veneration of icons. If it looks like a duck and it sounds like a duck, then the early Christians must have venerated it. Common sense is a good place to start in responding to that. If you go and walk the halls of any Protestant church, you're bound to find artwork. Would we conclude by Gabriel's logic that Protestants then venerate those icons? Of course not. And Brosseau mentions this in his lecture. He points out that yes, the early Christians did have artwork, but they didn't venerate them. But if common sense isn't enough, we have patristic scholarship. This is the Encyclopedia of Ancient Christianity. I'm going to recite this a few times, so it's worth noting that this is a massively peer-reviewed source with scores of patristic scholars contributing to it. It's also published in 2014, so it's very current, and it was compiled by Roman Catholics, so it makes it particularly applicable tonight. You can't argue that they have a bias against the veneration of icons, but here's what they have to say on the matter. "Use and veneration of images. One must distinguish the use of images for the decoration of churches, the instruction of the faithful, and as an aid to prayer, from the veneration of images properly speaking," which is something that Gabriel doesn't do. Before the Council of Nicaea, during this period, ecclesiastical writers were not willing to accept the use of, and even less the veneration of, images. Although most of the time they expressed themselves indirectly, they took a stance in the fight against pagan idolatry, basing themselves on the anti-image texts of the Old Testament. And he continues, "At times, their rejection of idolatry leads them to oppose those same arguments which were later adopted by the defenders of the veneration of images." And they go on to list Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Minucius, Felix, Lactantius, and the Council of Elvira as pre-Nicene sources, all of which we've seen from Brosseau. So in the end, we're left with just an argument from silence on Gabriel's side of the issue. Now, from here, we have two instances in the 4th century that Gabriel appeals to, that of Epiphanius and Eusebius. Now, with Epiphanius, when Bercot brought it up, it was a strong indicator that in the 4th century, there was still a resistance to the use of icons. Specifically, 32 minutes and 23 seconds into his lecture, he mentions the episode where Epiphanius goes to visit another church, and he's not incensed that there's an icon there necessarily, but very specifically, he's incensed that the embroidery of either Christ or an apostle is on the curtain that hangs in the doorway that leads into the nave of the church, and he tears it down. Now, Gabriel's response to this is to argue that the incident is spurious. The entire letter is a forgery by later iconoclasts, and he says that patristic scholars actually accept that as the case. However, we find back in the Encyclopedia of Ancient Christianity, Epiphanius' writings are listed as such. His works were mostly polemical. His masterpiece, the Panarion, the Anchorites, and the 3 works against images. The other 4 works accepted as authentic are all incomplete, on measures and weights, on the 12 jewels, letters, commentaries on scripture, and it's from the letters in particular that we see this incident with Epiphanius. Now, is that not a genuine letter? Well, we don't have to guess. Going back to the other volume from the Ancient Christian Writers, we have the following. In a letter to John of Jerusalem, translated into Latin by Jerome, letter 51 in the correspondence of the latter, Epiphanius reports that he found in Palestine, in a church in a village, a curtain on which was painted the image of Christ or a saint. Period. And at no point does it even question the validity of that account. So, do scholars reject it? It would appear not. In these writings, they will usually note if there's any controversy over a source that they're citing, and yet it's just accepted as genuine without question. Also, Eusebius of Caesarea. Now, it's odd that Gabriel would cite this one. It's a bit outdated. I'm going to quote some older scholarship to this effect. And when I say older, this particular work is from 1890. And the scholarly notation regarding the episode with Eusebius is as follows. There could be no doubt of Eusebius' honesty in the matter, but no less doubt that the statue commemorated something quite different from which Christian tradition claimed. And he goes on to continue. Eusebius himself, as we learn from the letter to the Empress Constantina Augustus. One moment. Augusta did not approve of the use of images representing Christ, on the ground that it tended to idolatry. In consequence of this disapproval, he fell into great dispute in the later image-worshipping church, his epistle being cited by the iconoclasts at the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, and his orthodoxy being, in consequence, fiercely attacked by the defenders of image worship, who dominated the council and won the day. Now, you could argue that that's an outdated source, or that it's biased, but has the scholarship changed since 1890? Well, back to the Encyclopedia of Ancient Christianity. In the 4th and 5th century, two isolated cases, the other case being that of Epiphanius of the 4th century, shows strong opposition to images. Eusebius testifies to having seen a monument erected in Peneus to Christ by a woman with the hemorrhage of blood, whom he had healed, and that the monument represented her with Jesus. Some think that it was actually Asapus, that's a separate issue, as well as paintings of Peter, Paul, and Jesus. He did not reprove the making of these images too harshly, attributing these things to pagan custom. However, when the Empress Constantina, sister of Constantine, and the widow of Licinius wanted to obtain from him an image of Christ, Eusebius rejected the request outright, saying that the human form of Christ was now completely deified and could not therefore be represented. So instead of supporting Gabriel's argument, these sources really only seem to condemn it. Finally, Gabriel cites one of my favorite quotations from Tertullian. I often use it to stress the importance of studying the early Christian writings today in order to better understand the scriptures. Gabriel cites it for very different reasons altogether, but I just wanted to quote the end of it again. Error of doctrine in the churches must necessarily have produced various issues. When, however, that which is deposited among many is found to be one and the same, it is not the result of error, but of tradition. Can anyone then be reckless enough to say that they were in error who handed on the tradition? And that last point in particular is important because Gabriel tries to argue that because all of the 4th and 5th century Christians venerated icons, which they didn't, as we've seen, but let's for the sake of argument say they did, because they all did, then we have to accept that as true. But Tertullian was specifically saying that it's not just the status quo in the present among all the churches, but it has to be demonstrated as something that has been passed down. So since we have the entire pre-Nicene church rejecting the veneration of icons, it cannot be said that just because it was universally accepted as a practice, universally, in the 4th and 5th century, that means it's a preservation of the apostolic tradition. It can't possibly be, with everything we've seen thus far. So where did the popularity of the belief come from? Well, this leads us to another small irony. In the beginning of his video, Gabriel says that he was heavily influenced by David Rousseau's premier work, Will the Real Heretics Please Stand Up, and that it got him into studying patristics himself. It's interesting then that in that very work, we find an answer to the question. No, these churches did not all independently come to this error. Rather, there was something that pushed that upon the churches at large. The section is titled, Instead of Carrying Their Cross, Christians Now Marketed the Cross. Next, Constantine's mother, Helena, got into the act. Following directions that she said God had given her in a dream, she journeyed to Jerusalem and claimed that she had found the tomb of Jesus. She also said that she found their crosses in the tomb, but she didn't know which one belonged to Jesus. So the 3 crosses were taken to a terminally ill woman, who supposedly was instantly cured when she touched the true cross of Jesus. This started a wave of relic mania. Within a short time, relics were appearing everywhere. Bones of prophets, pieces of the cross, garments worn by the apostles, and so on. Thousands of people were supposedly cured by touching or viewing these relics. Eventually, these relics were hawked by vendors who created a rather lucrative business from them. And he continues to go on to give examples from the late 6th century of just how far that devolved eventually. What do we do with all of this? Well, there's an interesting admission that Gabriel makes, starting at the 21-minute, 14-second mark in his video. So now what do we do with all of these quotes by the Ante-Nicene fathers, which David cites? If art deludes, as Clement of Alexandria writes, or if images drag the soul downward instead of heavenward, as Origen writes, and he seems to acknowledge that that is the case, conceding the point that they taught contrary to his tradition. But then he just goes off on a rant of, well, then why did Moses say this, and why did they do that in the Old Testament, and why is there artwork that exists? If it looks like a duck and it sounds like a duck. And interestingly, as they noted in the Encyclopedia of Ancient Christianity, as it was put, the rejection of idolatry leads them to oppose the same arguments that were later adopted by the defenders of the veneration of images. One of the arguments that, puzzlingly, again, Gabriel tries to make against Bercot is that, of course, we're not venerating the icons themselves, but the veneration is being passed through them. They are simply representative of a divine being. It's interesting that he would make the argument in the video to which he's supposed to be responding when David already specifically addressed how the early Christians responded to more nuanced pagan arguments that are to the effect of course, we don't worship the idols themselves. They just are representative of the gods who we worship, and we pass it on. Starting at the 37-minute mark in David's lecture, he specifically cites Athenagoras, Arnobius, and Lactantius as all addressing that very claim and rejecting it as error. And yet, Gabriel makes the argument as if it had not already been anticipated and preemptively refuted by David. And in the very end, I can't think of a better way to end this myself than the way Gabriel does. He actually argues, and I'm not making this up. If you haven't seen it, it's just before the 30-minute mark of his video. If you don't venerate icons, then you're committing idolatry. And I will let you, dear listeners, draw your own conclusions from that. Thank you.